He thought his city would just sign the documents and be done with it. But on the frozen island left to him by his great-grandfather, he uncovered journals and learned why the old man had guarded the land until his last breath. Share this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which city you are watching from. The snow had been falling since dawn, drifting past the cracked window of the tiny Chicago apartment where Ethan Walker sat with a stale cup of coffee cooling in his hands. The room was dim and plain, lit only by the gray of winter pressing against the glass. On the wall hung a single photograph taken years ago, back when Ethan was still a Navy SEAL and Ranger was only a young working dog learning to read the world through silence. Now Ethan lived between overdue rent notices and the dull ache in his injured knee. Ranger lay at his feet, 5 years old, black and tan fur rising and settling with each slow breath, the only steady presence left in a life that felt smaller by the month. Ethan had stopped thinking in grand plans. His days were reduced to small tasks, answering job boards, stretching the knee that refused to heal, writing half-finished applications he rarely sent. The world outside felt like something happening to other people, not to him. And then the envelope arrived, thick as if it carried someone else's future. Winter in Chicago, and the letter from the frozen lake. The wind scraped against the city like iron on stone, carrying the sting of mid-January cold. Chicago lay under a heavy quilt of gray snow, the kind that softened the skyline but sharpened every sound. In a cramped third-floor apartment overlooking a narrow street, Ethan Walker sat with his back against the wall, hands wrapped around a chipped mug that had long since lost its warmth. He was 40, broad-shouldered, built by years of service, yet the lines on his face told a quieter story than any battlefield. His dark hair was beginning to silver at the temples, and a short beard framed a jaw that always seemed clenched, as though bracing for a blow no one else could see. His left knee throbbed beneath worn denim, a souvenir from a rescue mission years ago. The doctors had called it manageable. The winter disagreed. The apartment around him was sparse, a sagging couch, a metal table missing a corner bolt, a box used as a nightstand. For months he had drifted between odd jobs, relying mostly on veteran assistance and whatever discipline kept him from unraveling. But exhaustion had a way of shifting shapes. In the desert it had been heat and sand. Here it was silence and the slow erosion of purpose. On the floor beside him lay Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a coat of deep black and warm tan. His ears were pricked, listening to footsteps in the hallway, the hum of pipes, the groan of wind against old brick. He wore a black service dog harness marked with white lettering. He carried himself with the confident stillness of a working dog who had learned too early what pain looked like in a man's eyes. Ethan reached down and brushed a hand over the dog's shoulders. "You hear everything," he murmured, "even things I don't want to notice." Ranger's amber eyes flicked upward, calm and steady, as if anchoring him. A knock came at the door. Ethan rose carefully, favoring his knee, and found a postal worker on the landing. The man was short, bundled in a thick navy jacket, cheeks red from the cold. His voice was brisk but friendly, shaped by long hours outdoors. "Certified letter for Ethan Walker," he said, handing over a cream-colored envelope. "Looks official. Stay warm out here." The worker left with a nod, boots echoing down the stairs. Ethan closed the door and stood for a long moment staring at the envelope. The return address was from a law office in Northwood, Minnesota, a remote lakeside town near Lake Superior. He knew no one there. When he finally tore the seal, a faint scent of old paper drifted out. The letter was brief, formal, and unsettlingly distant. It informed him that Henry Caldwell, his great-grandfather, a name spoken only in passing during one tense argument between his father and uncle, had passed away decades earlier, leaving behind a small private island and an abandoned boat workshop. Recent legal review had identified Ethan as the remaining heir. To accept transfer, he had to inspect the island in person. He read the letter twice, then dropped onto the couch. The island felt like a message from a man he had never met, a lifeline thrown across time, or a responsibility he did not ask for. Rent was overdue. His bank account had thinned to its bones. Chicago, with all its noise and cold and restless crowds, felt like it was pressing him flat. Selling the island could carry him through the year, maybe longer. Ranger rested his head on Ethan's knee, eyes questioning. Ethan let out a faint breath. "Yeah," he said softly, "maybe it's time to move." The decision wasn't sudden. It was a slow thaw, a quiet shift somewhere beneath scars and memory. That night, he gathered the few things he cared about, loaded his duffel into the old pickup truck parked outside, and tucked Ranger into the passenger seat. The dog sat tall, scanning the street as though already on duty. They left Chicago before dawn. Streetlights blurred into falling snow as the city shrank behind them, replaced by long highways cutting through Wisconsin's frost-bitten fields. The world north of Milwaukee grew quieter, pines heavy with ice, gas stations spaced like lonely outposts. The radio crackled more than it played. In the cab, Ethan let the drone of the road drown old thoughts. But now and then, memories surfaced. Faces from deployments, friends he buried, promises he couldn't keep. He wasn't running from them. He just didn't know how to live with them anymore. By afternoon, they reached Minnesota. Snow thickened, falling in slow curtains across the windshield. Small towns appeared and vanished like ghosts. Clusters of wooden houses, shuttered diners, hand-painted signs, advertising bait shops, and snowmobile rentals. They stopped briefly at a roadside cafe. Inside, a tall, thin waitress with curly red hair and kind brown eyes served them hot coffee. Her voice had a musical softness, the kind that made strangers relax without meaning to. She glanced at Ranger with a smile. "Handsome boy," she said. "Smart eyes. He looks like he knows more than he lets on." Ethan nodded. "He usually does." Her name tag read Lydia. She moved with practiced ease, the quiet confidence of someone who'd lived her whole life in winter towns. But beneath her pleasant tone was a weariness in her shoulders, a hint of someone carrying a burden she wouldn't name. Ethan recognized the posture. He'd seen it in mirrors. When they left, she called after him. "Northwood gets colder near the water. Keep your dog close." The sun was slipping when Ethan reached the old wooden pier noted in the letter. Lake Superior stretched ahead, a vast plate of steel-gray water rimmed with ice. Wind roared across the surface, sharp enough to bite exposed skin. Ranger jumped out, paws crunching on frozen snow, nose lifted to the air as though the lake carried a message. Only he could read. Far out, through drifting white, Ethan glimpsed the island, a low dark shape, crowned with bare trees, its shoreline swallowed in mist. He tightened his coat, exhaled a cloud of breath, and rested a hand on Ranger's back. The island waited, silent, cold, uncertain. And as the last light faded, man and dog stood together at the frozen edge of the world, unsure whether what lay ahead was the first step of a brighter path, or simply another stretch of darkness. The cabin on the island and the restless signs beneath the snow. The lake wind cut across the shoreline, carrying the smell of cold stone and wet pine. Ethan Walker stepped off the small motorboat, boots sinking into the untouched snow. The vessel belonged to Frank Halverson, the pier caretaker, a stout man in his late 60s with a square frame and a bristling white beard. Frank's cheeks were wind-burned, his gray eyes steady, like someone who had lived his entire life beside harsh winters. Even in silence, he emanated the calm of a man who met storms with both resignation and a quiet defiance. Years ago, a logging accident had left his right hand permanently stiff, giving him a habit of curling his fingers close to his palm, as though shielding an old hurt. Frank nodded as Ethan disembarked. "She's old land," he said, voice worn like river stones. "Quiet most days, but lakes don't forget things." Before Ethan could ask what that meant, Frank gave a thin smile, pushed off the pier, and turned his boat back toward the gray horizon. Ranger leapt from the dock, landing with practiced grace. Snow clung to his dark fur in small white freckles. He lowered his head, nose sweeping the air with intent. Ethan trusted that posture, alert, focused, listening for more than sound. They followed a narrow trail toward the center of the island, where the two-story log cabin waited, leaning slightly, as if bowed under decades of weather. Its shingled roof sagged, paint stripped away by relentless winters. The brick chimney bore long cracks, like lightning frozen in stone. Around the house lay piles of split logs, half-collapsed crates, and the skeletal frame of a small boat workshop. Its metal door rusted in streaks of orange. The sign above the workshop still held the faded lettering, Caldwell. Ethan paused beneath it, the weight of unfamiliar heritage pressing against his thoughts. Inside the cabin, dust lay everywhere, soft as ash. Furniture, though old, was arranged with a kind of deliberate care. An oak table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed tucked beneath a window that overlooked the lake. A kettle hung near the iron stove, its handle polished by hands long gone. Everything suggested the place had been lived in, then abandoned without haste. Ranger moved through the rooms with purpose. His nails tapped wildly across the floorboards as he cleared each space in widening arcs. When he reached the far end of the hallway, he stopped. His fur rose along his spine. He faced a door set low into the wall, a cellar door secured by an iron lock eaten by rust. Ethan tugged the handle. It held firm. A faint draft leaked from beneath the door, carrying a smell he couldn't place. Old wood, maybe, or something deeper and colder. He stepped back, unsettled. Wanting distraction, he climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. The air was colder up there, thin and edged with dust. Boxes were stacked with soldier-like neatness. In a dented tin trunk, he found photographs, sepia faces staring across decades, men with broad shoulders, women in wool coats, and one picture of Henry Caldwell as a young man, tall, unshaven, wearing a heavy coat and standing beside a boy of about 10 whose features tugged at Ethan's chest. The boy's eyes, wide, keen, and shadowed, were unmistakably Walker eyes. Ethan felt a pinch of something sharp beneath his ribs, regret for questions never asked, bitterness for all the silence that ran through his family like a second bloodstream. As the sun faded, the cold deepened. Ethan carried a few logs inside, coaxing flames into the stove. Ranger curled near the base of the couch, chin resting on his paws, amber eyes flickering with reflections of firelight. Exhaustion eventually pulled Ethan into sleep. It didn't last. A low, guttural sound rolled from Ranger's throat. The dog shot to his feet, ears cutting the darkness. Ethan jerked awake and reached for the flashlight. The cabin felt colder than before, the kind of cold that seemed to seep from the ground instead of the air. Ranger crept toward the front door, steps silent, muscles coiled. Ethan followed. A noise came from outside, barely there, a soft, deliberate crunch. Another. Footsteps across the porch. Ethan swung the door open. The night stared back, black trees, hard snow, a sky churned with clouds. No footprints on the porch, only wind-blown ridges. The lake beyond was still as iron. Ranger didn't calm. He kept staring toward a cluster of pine shadows at the edge of the clearing, body rigid. Ethan shone the flashlight, but the beam hit only branches dancing in the wind. Still, the feeling crept along his spine. Someone had been there, close, listening, testing the boundaries of the island just as he and Ranger were trying to understand it. He closed the door, secured the latch, and sat beside Ranger on the floor. The dog finally lowered himself, but his gaze stayed fixed on the window, unblinking. Ethan exhaled slowly. "What did you hear, boy?" Ranger didn't move. The wind outside rose to a long, wavering moan, slipping through cracks in the cabin walls and carrying with it the unmistakable sense that the island was not waiting for him to arrive. It had been waiting for someone to return. The fire dimmed, shadows stretched, and Ethan felt the first tremor of unease that would follow him into the coming days. And though he knew exhaustion might be playing tricks, one truth clawed its way into his thoughts. They were not alone on the island. The northern stone vault and the buried truth. The morning rose pale and muted, as though the island itself was reluctant to wake. A thin layer of frost coated the window panes inside the cabin, forming small, branching shapes that shimmered when the first gray light slipped through. Ethan Walker pushed himself up from the couch, feeling the familiar ache tug at his left knee. Ranger was already awake, sitting near the door with a quiet alertness that made Ethan uneasy. The cabin felt different after the night before, still, but not peaceful. Ethan dressed in layered flannel and pulled on his heavy coat. The wood stove crackled faintly behind him, but its warmth felt thin against the cold seeping from the floor. Ranger stayed close, following him into the small workshop behind the cabin. The workshop was cluttered, but not chaotic. The scent of old cedar and metal shavings lingered in the air. Dust particles drifted lazily in the slanted light, entering through the cracked window. Ethan worked methodically, lifting boxes, examining shelves, his breath clouding with each movement. Ranger sniffed along the corners, tail stiff, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. On a narrow shelf near the back wall, half hidden beneath peeling blue paint, Ethan found a small hook. Simbos. A single key hung from it, thin, iron, with a decorative swirl etched near the bow. Its edges were sharp, untouched by rust, unlike the rest of the workshop's metal pieces, as though someone had placed it there recently, not decades ago. "Looks like they wanted someone to find you," Ethan murmured. Ranger's ears twitched as Ethan brought the key to a heavy steel chest resting under a workbench. The chest was thick, reinforced, secured with a two-tiered locking mechanism. Ethan inserted the key. The chest opened with a low metallic sigh, as though exhaling after years of waiting. Inside lay oilcloth-wrapped notebooks, brittle folders, and rolled maps of the lake. He recognized the handwriting immediately, the same steady script found on the photographs in the attic. Henry Caldwell, younger here in ink than in his faded pictures, had written pages of meticulously kept logs. One notebook described winter crossings on the lake, delivering supplies and sometimes people, runaways, battered women, veterans wrestling shadows no one could see, children who needed a hiding place. Henry had offered the island as shelter when the world refused them one. Another set of documents revealed something darker. Copies of shipping manifests, photographs taken at night showing unmarked barrels dumped into the deeper waters off the western side. Ethan traced the red circles drawn on the lake maps. The notation beside one read, "Routinely used drop site. Toxic. Avoid during thaw." Ranger let out a soft whine. Ethan turned. The dog stood by the workshop door, staring out toward the north side of the island. His posture was rigid, nose lifted, body leaning into some muted scent. Only he could decipher. "You want me to follow," Ethan said. Ranger moved immediately, slipping through the door and trotting along the narrow trail leading away from the clearing. Ethan followed, boots sinking into snow as the forest deepened around them. The northern edge of the island was wilder, thicker pines, sharp rocks crusted with ice, and a sharp descent toward the cliffs overlooking Lake Superior. The wind cut harder here. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter, scanning the area. Ranger led him behind a curtain of low-hanging branches. There, nearly swallowed by snowdrifts, was a squat iron door set into a natural rock face. Ethan brushed the snow away. The door was old but not rusted. Its hinges appeared to have been oiled not long ago. Someone had been here. With a few harsh tugs, the latch gave way. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow passage descending into cold darkness. Ethan took his flashlight and stepped inside. The stone vault was small, no larger than a storage room. Cold radiated from the rock walls, cutting through his coat. Stacked along the far side were 3 wooden crates sealed with metal strapping. He pried one open. Inside were photographs, grainy, time-stamped, taken from a distance. They showed a cargo vessel under different names at different ports, but always the same grim task, lowering unmarked barrels into the lake. Another crate contained taped interviews, whistleblowers, former employees, frightened workers whose faces were blurred but whose voices trembled with truths they feared to speak aloud. The final crate held a ledger listing payments from a corporate entity Ethan didn't recognize, though the name felt familiar. His stomach tightened as he recalled the letter mentioning repeated attempts to purchase the island. A sudden noise echoed faintly from outside the vault, a crunch of snow, quick, deliberate. Ethan killed the flashlight and froze, listening. Ranger growled, low but fierce, positioning himself between Ethan and the entrance. Footsteps. Ethan moved toward the doorway, muscles tight and ready, but when he stepped into the light, the forest was empty. Only the wind stirred the branches overhead, yet the faint impression of a boot mark lay near the entrance, fresh, crisp in the snow. Someone else had come to the island, someone aware of Henry's secrets, someone who didn't want them uncovered. He returned to the cabin as the sky turned a muted silver. Ranger stayed close, ears swiveling, muscles coiled, as if expecting the night visitor to return. Ethan placed Henry's notebooks on the table, staring at the ink that had survived storms, seasons, and silence. He felt something settle inside him, not fear, but clarity. The island was not simply a relic of his past. It was a battleground his great-grandfather had chosen, and now someone expected Ethan to either walk away or be pushed out. He rested his hand on Ranger's head. "We're not leaving," he whispered, and Ranger, steady as always, pressed closer as though he had known the answer all along. The blizzard, the stranger, and the soldier's choice. The sky had darkened into a heavy sheet of iron by late afternoon, the kind of sky that warned every old instinct that something violent was coming. Ethan Walker stood on the porch, breath misting in the sharp cold, while Ranger paced along the railing, tail stiff, ears pricked toward the lake. Even before the sound reached Ethan, the dog had sensed it. A motor, smooth, modern, and out of place on a winter-locked island. The sleek boat cut through the water like a blade, its engine purring instead of roaring. When it drifted near the shore, a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out. Victor Hale looked like he had been carved from polished stone. He wore a charcoal wool coat that hugged his athletic frame, slim black gloves, and leather shoes that somehow avoided collecting snow. His jawline was sharp, clean-shaven, and his dark hair was slicked back with meticulous care. There was a cold elegance in his movement, a man accustomed to boardrooms and controlled environments, not the unpredictable brutality of winter wilderness. Victor offered a courteous smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Walker," he greeted, his voice smooth and even, every syllable practiced. "I apologize for the unannounced visit, but time is a luxury my employers, or yours, might not have." Ranger growled softly, the low rumble vibrating through the cold air. Victor didn't flinch. He merely adjusted the grip on his black leather briefcase. "I represent Hale and Breton Development," he continued. "We own most of the shoreline around this lake. Your island has become the missing piece. We're prepared to offer you a substantial amount, enough to make your current hardships disappear." Ethan kept his face still. "Not for sale." Victor's expression didn't break, but something tightened at the corners of his mouth. "You're unemployed, living on a decaying island with," his gaze flicked briefly to Ranger, "a service dog and a knee that won't heal. Consider what you're turning down." Ethan didn't answer. Victor's tone softened, but the softness felt calculated. "Think carefully. Some discoveries on this island could be dangerous if misunderstood. You wouldn't want the wrong people looking into things you didn't mean to find." That landed like a warning, and a promise. The conversation ended there. Victor returned to his boat, leaving only the rumble of the engine and a long trail of unease behind him. By nightfall, the storm arrived. Wind howled through the trees like a living thing. Snow swirled across the island in furious spirals. Visibility shrank to a few feet. The cabin walls trembled as though a giant leaned against them with both hands. Inside, Ethan secured the shutters while Ranger patrolled anxiously, nails clicking across the floor. The dog's unease made Ethan's skin crawl. Ranger rarely showed nerves, not even in war zones. Lightning flashed across the lake, illuminating a world of ghostly white. Then Ranger froze. He whipped his head toward the northern side of the cabin and barked once, sharp and urgent. "Show me," Ethan said. Ranger bolted through the door, Ethan close behind. Snow stung his face like needles. Wind shoved at him with icy fists. But through the chaos, he saw movement, a staggering silhouette near the cliffside. Someone was dragging a heavy object toward the water. Ranger growled, and Ethan's gut twisted. The stone vault. He signaled the dog to flank and moved low, muscles remembering the old rhythm. Quiet steps, steady breath, harnessing the storm as cover. The figure stumbled. For a brief second, lightning lit up the scene. It was a man in his late 30s, gaunt, with a narrow face and unkempt dark hair plastered to his forehead. Snow clung to his cheap puffer jacket. His eyes were frantic, unfocused. Ethan recognized him from Victor's boat, Mark Denning, the man who stood behind Victor earlier, carrying equipment, never speaking. He had the nervous energy of someone who had spent years in someone else's shadow, always following orders, never questioning. Mark had a leather case pressed against his chest, the same kind Victor carried, but this one was battered, soaked, and clasped shut with panicked desperation. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, voice swallowed by the storm. Mark turned, wild-eyed. "They'll blame me if they find this. I'm not going down for him." He didn't see the thin sheet of ice beneath him until it cracked like a gunshot. The lake opened beneath him. He vanished with a cry strangled by freezing water. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the coil of rescue rope tied to the cabin post, looped it around his torso, and threw the other end to Ranger. "Hold!" he commanded. Ranger braced himself instantly, paws digging into the snow, low muscles straining like iron cables. Ethan crawled onto the cracked ice, feeling it groan beneath him. He reached the edge, plunged his arm down, and grabbed Mark's coat collar. The man was shaking violently, eyes rolling with shock and terror. "Don't let go!" Ethan barked. With Ranger anchoring the line, Ethan hauled the shivering man out of the water and dragged him toward thicker ice. They collapsed onto snow, gasping. Mark clutched the drenched briefcase. He said no one could know." Ethan grabbed the case. "You're done following orders." By dawn, the storm had calmed. Ethan radioed the mainland. Local officers, bundled in heavy Navy parkas, faces wrapped with wool scarves, arrived in a small rescue boat. Their team leader, Officer Sarah Dunham, was a tall woman with a sturdy build, storm-gray eyes, and blonde hair tied in a severe braid. Years of winter rescues had carved determination into her features. A thin scar traced her left cheek, a mark from a wilderness search she once refused to abandon. Sarah listened. jaw clenched, as Ethan handed over the case and described the vault. "We've had whispers about Hale and Breton for years," she said. "Never proof. Until now." Victor, intercepted at the harbor, was brought in for questioning. His polished confidence evaporated when confronted with Mark's testimony and Henry Caldwell's preserved evidence. Back at the cabin, Ethan sat beside the fire with Ranger resting against his leg. They had faced the truth head-on, not run from it, and for the first time since stepping onto the island, Ethan felt the faintest shift inside him. Not safety, but certainty. He and Ranger had chosen their side, and they weren't leaving. The island of returning veterans, the thaw came slowly to the northern lake, as though winter refused to loosen its grip. Yet the light had changed. It crept earlier across the water, glowed softer against the snow, and hinted at a gentler season waiting beneath the ice. Ethan Walker felt it each morning when he stepped outside the cabin. The air still bit at his skin, but the world no longer felt hostile. It felt watchful, listening, settling. Word of the investigation spread across the small Minnesota towns like wind passing through pine branches. Newspaper columns carried clipped summaries of Hale and Breton's illegal dumping, accompanied by grainy photos of sealed barrels and nighttime operations. Victor Hale's arrest reached the front page of the Northwood Sentinel. Mark Denning's testimony, shaking, hesitant, but damning, became a turning point in the region's demand for accountability. Ethan received a letter of gratitude from the county. It was handwritten by a woman named Deputy Commissioner Joan Whitaker, a stout, middle-aged official with a stern signature shaped like careful block letters. She wrote in neat, deliberate strokes, thanking him for upholding the integrity of the lake and confirming that Caldwell Island was legally protected private land, permanently exempt from industrial acquisition. Ethan placed the letter in a drawer, not because it mattered on paper, but because it meant Henry's stand, and now his own, was seen. A week later, another envelope arrived by supply boat. This one bore the emblem of Northland Veterans Outreach, a nonprofit known throughout the Great Lakes region. The letter was signed by Samuel Briggs, a tall, broad-shouldered veteran in his late 50s who occasionally visited isolated communities with therapy dogs. He had once been a Marine canine handler. The work had carved his face into deep lines, but the kindness in his hazel eyes softened everything else. Samuel wrote that he had read Ethan's story. He proposed something simple but life-changing: renovate the property into a retreat for veterans struggling with PTSD. A quiet place with wood smoke, open water, and silence. Exactly the kind of silence that doesn't suffocate but rebuilds. Ethan read the letter twice, then handed it to Ranger. The dog sat, tail sweeping the floor once, as if giving his approval. Days turned into weeks as help arrived, not all at once, but in steady trickles. The first to step onto the shore was Caleb Foster, a former Army medic around Ethan's age. Caleb was lean, with ash-brown hair and a patchy beard grown in uneven lengths. His eyes were a soft green, but carried shadows that only other soldiers recognized. Years earlier, he had survived an IED blast that took the life of his closest friend. Ever since, he moved with the cautious patience of a man who had learned not to rush anything fragile, including himself. Caleb arrived with a duffel of tools and a quiet greeting. "Heard you needed hands," he said. "I've got two." Behind him came Jordan Tate, a stocky Navy veteran with dark skin, cropped black hair, and forearms covered in faded tattoos, names, dates, coordinates. Jordan laughed easily, but spoke little about his past. When he did, it was in pieces, as though sharing too much might break something he was still holding together. The third volunteer was Marla Quinn, not a soldier, but a former search and rescue officer. She was tall and athletic, with auburn hair pulled back in a long braid. Her freckles stood out against pale winter skin, and her voice carried the steady tone of someone used to giving orders during blizzards. She came with her own D, a sandy-colored Labrador retriever named Baxter. Older and slower than Ranger, but calm-eyed and well-trained. Ranger greeted Baxter with a stiff sniff, then relaxed noticeably. Ethan smiled. He approves. Together, the group turned the island into a working project. They repaired the cabin roof, laid new beams, insulated the walls, and strengthened the boat workshop. Caleb proved surprisingly skilled with carpentry, his hands steady and precise. Jordan hauled lumber with tireless determination, humming old marching tunes beneath his breath. Marla cleared snow, patched windows, and trained Baxter to help guide other dogs through the slippery forest paths. Ranger served as the quiet commander of the canine troop, demonstrating patience even when Baxter wandered or when Jordan's adopted mutt, Kip, barked at shadows. Some nights, they gathered around the fireplace. The flames glowed warm against worn faces, and stories drifted, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the gentle sort people tell only when they feel safe. Ethan listened more than he spoke. The others seemed to understand that some men rebuilt themselves in silence. One evening, after the others had gone to their bunks in the refurbished workshop, Ethan sat alone with a fresh, empty journal. Ranger stretched beside him, head on his paws. Snow fell lightly outside but didn't cling to the window. It melted on contact, turning to droplets that slid down the glass like soft breaths. Ethan opened the journal. He wrote slowly at first, lines forming like steps across uncertain ground. He wrote about Henry's stubborn courage, about the evidence hidden in the vault, the storm night, the rescue, about the island's strange ability to draw in the lost and give them space to breathe. Then he wrote a message for whoever might arrive decades from now. This island once carried secrets. Now it carries people. If you come after us, may you find the same quiet strength we found here. Let the trees teach patience. Let the lake teach truth. When he finished, he placed the folded page inside a small metal box, Henry's old coffee tin, dented and worn from years of use. Ethan tucked it into a corner of the wall and sealed it behind a loose board, just as his great-grandfather had done. Outside, the snow brightened with the reflection of firelight. Later, Ethan stepped onto the porch with Ranger. The lake was calm, almost glass-like, reflecting a sky filled with distant stars. Ranger brushed against his leg, warm and steady. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head. "This place was burdened once," he whispered. "Now it's the start of something." Ranger nudged his hand, and the world felt whole in a way he hadn't known in years. No more wondering whether the future was bright or dark. It would be what they built, with patience, protection, and open doors for those still searching for their way home. When Ethan stood on the porch that final night, watching the soft glow of the fire spill across the snow, he understood something he had never been able to name before. The island had not saved him by accident. The storms he survived, the strangers who came, the truth that rose from the water, all of it felt guided, as though every step had been watched over by a hand greater than his own. Some people call it fate, some call it grace. Ethan knew it was a kind of quiet miracle, because sometimes God does not speak through thunder or signs written in the sky. Sometimes he speaks through a loyal dog who never gives up on you, through strangers who arrive exactly when you need them, through a ruined island that becomes a home when your heart is ready to be rebuilt. And just like Ethan, we all walk through seasons of loss, fear, and uncertainty. We may not inherit an island, but we each inherit days, ordinary days, full of small chances to begin again, to open a door, to offer kindness, to hold on when the night feels too long. Those moments are miracles too, if we look closely enough. So, tonight, may God bless you and keep you safe wherever you are watching from. May He guide your steps the way He guided Ethan's, toward healing, courage, and new beginnings. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others may feel its warmth. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope, faith, and the quiet miracles that shape our lives. May the Lord watch over you and those you love, today, tomorrow, and every step ahead.